You see, they are as drunk as I am. They are clean by comparison. They are a group called the Sex Pistols. I know one thing. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach and Brahms have all died. Really? What are we saying, sir?
Wonderful people.
What you were doing?
I always wanted to meet you.
Did you really?
Yeah.
We'll meet afterwards, shall we?
You dirty sod. You dirty old man.
Well, keep going, Chick. Keep going. Go on, you've got another 5 seconds.
Killed those 3 Wall Street guys.
Okay, I'm waiting for the punchline. I don't think so.
When you cross a mentally ill loner with a society that abandons him and treats him like trash,
Call the police,
I'll
Gene.
tell you what you get.
Call the police.
You get what you fucking deserve.
I want you to get up now. To get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell.
This is an announcement, not a press conference. Therefore, there will be no questions.
Your newspapers, they won't tell you the truth. It's not in their interest to tell you the truth.
Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the Mafia.
It's too dangerous to them. If you want the truth in this country, you have to seek it out.
This reading is dedicated to the thief, the noble thief, lurking in the alleyway.
Robert Mapplethorpe was a photographer who lived and worked in New York City. His photographic art dealt with subjects ranging from homosexuality to BDSM, and he self-described much of it as pornographic in nature. Living and working in the time and place he did, we can understand Mapplethorpe as both product of and practitioner within several different subcultures that overlapped with one another. The avant-garde art world, the gay community of New York, and through at least his connection with Patti Smith, the punk rock, art rock scene of the Bowery in the mid to late 1970s. During a traveling exhibition of his collected works in 1989, a controversy erupted when the media reported that the project had been subsidized in part by the National Endowment for the Arts. The photographs portrayed, among other taboo subjects, depictions of uriphagia, or the drinking of urine. Speaking of which, in 1987, 2 years earlier, the photographic artist Andres Serrano had created a huge uproar upon the exhibition of his piece entitled Immersion. It showed a crucifix submerged in a jar of urine. As with the Mapplethorpe exhibit, Serrano's work had been underwritten in part by money from the publicly funded NEA. Social conservatives, religious organizations, and politicians joined forces in vilifying the endowment. Both Mapplethorpe and Serrano's work were considered filth that emblematized a morally bankrupt society. With these two artists and their work, I think we have a good starting point for defining the two critical concepts that relate the film Joker to what I feel is its principal cultural antecedent, the punk movement. Those two concepts are semiotics and subculture. Both Mapplethorpe and Serrano created art within a milieu of people that philosophized about and celebrated semiotic disruptions, using images in ways that the larger society might consider blasphemous, immoral, sickening. They transgress the borders of what is considered acceptable, perhaps for political reasons, certainly out of personal artistic ambition, and I'd guess out of a perverse curiosity about what happens to society when you create a cultural shockwave. So here's the question. How is culturally transgressive art produced, and what does it actually mean? After all, who still cares to be outraged about Piss Christ? punk. At its high point, it was a truly disturbing force in the social order. Quaint as punk may appear now, documentaries like The Filth and the Fury remind us of the volatile state of social and political affairs in the late 1970s, which punk was the significant cultural response. Punk was an aestheticized reaction to a set of very real, protracted material problems, namely housing, jobs, and overall quality of life. And because it made an aesthetic commentary carried out by the people playing the music to those attending the concerts, it then spread the gospel through the clothes they wore and the attitude they adopted. Co-optation and neutralization by the capitalist system was the natural outcome. Sadly, this is not a unique experience. Cultural historians like Thomas Frank, for example in his book The Conquest of Cool, described this co-optation as a constitutive phenomenon of capitalism, reflecting back to the masses in commodified form their own subcultural disturbances. In his particular case study, it was the 1960s hippie aesthetic and its vampiric seizure by business advertisers. But as I said, there was always something materially going on underneath this stylistic display. Here are scenes from The Filth and the Fury and The Joker. It can be kind of hard to tell which is which. Joker as a story is set in the early 1980s, with Gotham clearly a stand-in for New York City. And like London in the late 70s, New York at this time suffered a prolonged strike by sanitation workers, resulting in heaps of trash on every street corner. For many people living in the two cities at the time, the garbage piled high represented civilization on the decline and one in need of rescuing. Neoliberalism, simply defined as the retreat of the state from providing for public welfare and the imposition of the market as the solution, became the prescription for both Great Britain and the US. It's a prescription we're still living with, even as the disease of inequality continues to spread unabated. The opening of the movie shows trash to be the defining motif and the central metaphor for Arthur Fleck's life. Gotham is 18 days into a strike by municipal garbage workers. We see Arthur's sign stolen by truant kids. He chases them into an alley and is subsequently beaten. We see him on the ground in pain, and piled high on both sides of him is the garbage of the city. The film's title, Joker, is then overlaid from top to bottom. This opening scene conflates the character of Arthur with the context in which he lives. Several subsequent scenes further exemplify Arthur's untouchable caste position. When he makes faces to amuse a child while riding a city bus, the child's mother sternly tells Arthur to leave my kid alone. The social worker Arthur is forced to see informs him that the city is making drastic cuts to social service programs. Arthur will no longer be receiving therapy or assistance to pay for his 7 medication. Arthur then loses his job as a clown for hire at the temp agency. As a final insult, Arthur is left bleeding on the floor of a high society bathroom after confronting Thomas Wayne, a city magnate running for mayor, about possibly being his father. Here is Johnny Rotten describing himself and his cohort as throwaway members of society.
King's Road with complete anger and resentment. And there was trash piled 10 foot high. They seem to have missed that. Wear the garbage bag, for God's sake, and then you're dealing with it. And that's what I would be doing. I would wrap myself basically in trash.
The punk movement was founded on a sense of working class anger at being discarded, and they purposely chose outward signifiers in dress and attitude that projected that sense of being thrown away, and of throwing away the parent culture in turn. Consider it mutually assured rejection. Every conceivable form of outrageous taboo was on the table, and we will get to the crucial one in a moment. It was aesthetic signification pitched as noise, which lined up nicely with the musical style, in which nothing was prohibited, from the sacred relics of British society to the Revolver. And because everything was permitted and kind of jumbled together, none of it meant anything, and the movement was kind of politically nebulous as a result. Dick Hebdige wrote perhaps the definitive study of punk aesthetics, Subculture, the Meaning of Style, and in it he asks the following question. How can we discern any positive values reflected in objects chosen only to be discarded? Basically, can something come from pure negative expression? The punks want it to mean, whether they own up to it or not. And in the same way, Joker as a story both delights in and rejects the idea of meaninglessness. So how is it doing that? Arthur's story comes to resemble, as pointed out in a Jacobin movie review, a melodrama. Arthur is a character in the mold of Jean Valjean in Les Miserables or any number of Dickensian stories of the downtrodden. And like the protagonists of those melodramas, Arthur commits a fatal act which will haunt him and transform his life. While riding a subway, Arthur breaks out into laughter, a medical condition he can't control, at the sight of 3 Wall Street brokers harassing a woman sitting alone. The 3 men then proceed to do this.
Hey, hold it steady, Stay down, freak!
Arthur retaliates by shooting and killing all 3 men. It's eye for an eye justice in excess, and yet the moment produces a schism between our judgmental morality and our sentimental feelings toward Arthur. Like all good melodramas are capable of doing, we come to rationalize the violence in name of a higher principle. Arthur has regained some semblance of human dignity. In the scenes that follow, Arthur's life continues to unravel, and he takes the lives of more of those who have wronged him. The betraying co-worker, the abusive mother. It's an odd origin story to implant in a comic book villain, and it's made even stranger by what happens in the city of Gotham itself. Many of the other residents come to identify with Arthur, aka the vigilante clown, as the leader of an incipient protest movement. This underclass mob dons the mask of the clown as a show of solidarity with one another against the elite. A tabloid newspaper can be seen multiple times with the headline, "Kill the Rich." Taking this all in, Joker resembles leftist propaganda, wearing its political heart perhaps a little too conspicuously on its sleeve. So, imagine, if you will, that in the third act of Death Wish, Paul Kersey entered a local TV station, took everyone hostage, and then went on air to read from the Communist Manifesto. You might feel a little discombobulated watching this, right? Like the story had suddenly made a hard ideological lurch. You would feel the hands behind the scenes manipulating the story from being a reactionary vigilante picture into leftist agitprop. Or let's use the real-world example that most closely resembles what happens in the film.
2 of the teenagers are at Bellevue Hospital. The other 2, most seriously injured, are here at St. Vincent's, both in critical but stable condition.
The man told the conductor of the train, in his words, "They tried to rip me off," and he jumped from the train and fled.
In the aftermath of Getz's shootings in December of 1984, popular opinion swung in his favor, with only a few embattled commentators making the point that vigilantism of the Death Wish style was not only illegal, but corrosive if condoned by civilized society. This critique should have had more traction because in subsequent interviews with authorities, Getz admitted to having Death Wish-style fantasies in his head before the incident even happened. The crucial distinction between Getz's real-life act of violence and the Joker film is the skin color and class affiliation of the victims. Getz shot and wounded 4 black teenagers at a time when inner-city crime was high and racial animus followed suit. Stoked by opportunistic, dog-whistling politicians of the law and order variety.
Crime in our society. Many of you have written to me how afraid you are to walk the streets alone at night. We must make America safe again, especially for women.
Fleck shot and killed 3 white Wall Street brokers at a time post-2008 in which hostility toward financial elites has not dissipated all that much. If Getz had been revealed to be a hardcore leftist radical, it wouldn't have made any sense to anybody of any political persuasion. However, the signifiers get a little more muddled when configured the other way around. By manipulating the identity of the victims, the film can pull a fast one. Use together vigilanteism with leftist politics. Analyses of this sort are a branch of study called semiotics, the placement and meaning of signs in public space. One could argue that in this instance, typical semiotic meaning is denaturalized, to use Roland Barthes' term, which I feel is the quintessence of Joker's allure. We seek out the transgressive nature of it because it opens up spaces for new meaning. As audiences, we are simply not accustomed to seeing left heroes as anything but martyrs. Take the recent film about Fred Hampton as but one example of many.
They don't know what Black Panther Party.
For a certain kind of mind, and I'll own up to this, Joker is kind of hypnotic because it actually implies transformative possibilities through obscene events. The melodramatic events that precede the shootings lay the groundwork for all of the semiotic spectacle of the third act. Arthur is himself a victim, a societal victim. So in his act of killing, he is displaying righteous self-actualization and agency, reclaiming political power denied to him. Except he killed 3 people in cold blood, who, like Getz's victims, were unarmed themselves. Except they were entitled creeps, who probably do crimes against ordinary people every day on Wall Street, and maybe they deserved... Oh wait, they aren't real. None of this is real. And the extent to which the audience is meant to be enlightened or merely titillated by what's taking place on screen gets at the mystification of signs. What is the surface and what is the depth? And if the former is disturbed, do we get to peer further down, or is there nothing further down at all? This may be the problem with politicizing style in the first place. Hebdige writes, "We should not underestimate the signifying power of the spectacular subculture not only as a metaphor for potential anarchy out there, but as an actual mechanism of semantic disorder, a kind of temporary blockage in the system of representation." I think the key word is temporary. The character of Joker does distort the system of representation because it permits the impermissible. The question that lingers, though, is what comes next? In the 70s, punk artists such as Siouxsie Sioux, Sid Vicious, Johnny Rotten, and many more were photographed wearing swastika t-shirts and armbands. Or take this guy standing in the background on the Bill Grundy show which opened the video. Even David Bowie was quoted at the time extolling the virtues of Adolf Hitler. The mid-70s saw a kind of resurgence in Nazi rhetoric and iconography, some of it legitimately political. The failures of labor in Britain prompted the growth of the National Front, to name one iteration. But for the punks, the Nazi branding had another purpose, or maybe it's better to consider it an anti-purpose. Remember that excerpted epigraph from the Futurist Manifesto? I deliberately included these nasty bits. Not as an endorsement of the author's values, who I assume was sincere and who led a whole movement founded on extreme artistic provocation before moving on to out-and-out fascism, but as a kind of show and tell to better illustrate what the punks were up to. If you've made it this far, you've either ignored these bits of hate speech, rationalized them away, or perhaps were intrigued by the obnoxiousness of them to hang on for some kind of explanation. So here it is. I think futurism is a silly historical curiosity and nothing more. Plus, I think World War I gave the whole movement a kind of overdose of reality. But explaining my intentions is pretty much antithetical to the punk ethos. Once the outrage has been washed through critical discourse, the game is over. And wearing the swastika was kind of a game. The game as played was to challenge all accepted norms for public speech. Taboo iconography was what they dug up to achieve that end. The display of Nazi imagery is an example of semiotic disordering, as Hebdige puts it. A normal first reaction to seeing the swastika even now is to recoil in shock, followed closely by a sense of confusion. But the London punks right-wing reactionaries? I don't doubt that there were some National Front Nazis in the larger punk scene, but in the main, we have to say that the punk movement was at least quasi-left-wing. Certainly anti-imperialist, the Sex Pistols, anti-capitalist, the Gang of Four, anti-sexist, X-Ray Specs, anti-racist, Clash, anti-authoritarian, all of them. So what gives? Why engage with a symbol welded to fascism? To ask the question is to answer it with a smirk, because the question itself is founded on notions of decency and politeness that in some sense substitute for politics. Policing the discourse, whether intended or not, can have the effect of obscuring larger structural issues. It pantomimes action but reveals impotency. The only viable political ground becomes the discourse itself. Nowadays it can be identitarian social media nonsense, civility outrages du jour, and even the hot takes about this movie at the time of its release are all good examples of the utterly sterile ground of norm policing. Maintaining propriety, especially during the Trump years, became the equivalent of manning the citadels. For many on the left today, as with the punks of the 70s, preserving the norms above all else was to succumb to political inertia, to be mired in the what is forever. The chaser for apathy of the punks was a shot of pure antipathy. While not formally articulated, the heterodox punk movement came to coalesce around a feeling that the only political recourse left in a world of failed revolutions was through aesthetics, and in this case that meant specific shocking displays that transgress the norms of society. Consider it the Situationist movement redux, or the Futurist manifesto in spirit, if not in substance. Replete with safety pins, spiked hair, bondage gear, and yes, the swastika. These were disruptive, symbolic behaviors in public spaces, which might create a pathway to something new, if the logic even went that far. Or, from a nihilistic perspective, the punks were simply tearing it all down, and doing so by shitting on the one source of pride British folks were still holding on to, winning the last big war. The swastika, for punks, is a pure semiotic transgression. The Joker as a combination of vigilante and left-wing martyr achieves something very similar, and it suggests that perhaps the melodramatics in the movie are ironically situated, that sincerity itself might be up for grabs. As Hebdige writes, punks seem to be parodying the alienation and emptiness, celebrating in mock heroic terms the death of the community and the collapse of traditional forms of meaning. This is the essence of Joker, an agent of chaos dressed in melodrama, parodying left politics. Such semiotic incoherence is usually the territory of dark comedy or satire. To play all of this straight makes Joker kind of rare. In a brief aside on this point, take a look at this interview of Sid Vicious in 1978. Here he is sitting in a park, wearing his swastika t-shirt, while lamenting the breakup of the band and relating to the interviewer his sorrow at being a junkie. The incongruity between his aesthetic nihilism and his earnest, even melodramatic expression of feeling enacts in real terms the very same irony submerged in Joker. Two other points must be brought up in the film that relate to this idea of heightened semiotic dissonance. Arthur's plight is fundamentally material, but laid on top of that are his psychological disorders, exacerbated by the material situation he's in and his odd personality. People go out of their way to avoid him. He repeats this idea several times. He doesn't exist. The effect of his erasure from the dominant society is the negation of political agency. Ultimately, Arthur's remedy can only come about through the wielding of some form of power, through violence, as it turns out. until such time his image will either be scorned, for example in the opening scene, exploited, which happens when Murray books him as a gag for his late-night TV show, or even appropriated, as when the emerging protest movements against austerity use his clown image in solidarity. The last one, appropriation for political purposes, gets us perhaps the closest to the punk movement itself. All of this to say, and it's so obvious that it almost creates its own camouflage against critical reflection, is that for all intents and purposes, Arthur Fleck is not white, at least as far as the cultural perception and stereotyping of the urban milieu is continually reproduced. In Subculture, Hedbridge writes that punk music included reggae as a present absence, a black hole around which punk composed itself. Similarly, in the case of the movie, the black hole around which Arthur's character is structured is the seemingly intentional absence of black representations of the same urban plight. And how we know this is intentional is the parade of black female characters which castigate, confuse, and ultimately reject Arthur, but who have no stories of their own to tell. It is the last one that Arthur kills, and within the structure of the narrative, it lacks a sincere motivation, and it feels calculated, serving nefarious purposes outside of the story itself. The movie has taken a lot of hits for being a manifesto of the misogynist white male incel, but what gets conveniently left out is the context of Arthur's life. He lives in a major metropolis. He is surrounded by trash and urban decay. He takes subpar public transportation to get around. He does low-paid service work. He lives in a slum apartment with his mother. He is a victim of the neoliberal regime which prescribed cuts to essential services for inner-city residents. His whole existence is pitched on a razor's edge.
People are upset.
Precarity and marginalization are the key descriptors of his life. Some of Arthur's traits relate to the incel personality. Others, however, most assuredly don't. They are agglomerations of characteristics associated with minority groups, or with poor people in general. And just to be clear, real life is complicated and cuts against generalizations at every turn. I'm talking about the stories the media tells about minority groups, the hegemonic discourse, if you will, of the other. So in Arthur's abrasive interactions with black women, despite being a marginal character himself, who expresses no outwardly racist attitudes, our wires get crossed in how we are to determine empathy. We reach for whatever tools are at hand, and at the moment, identity politics seems to be the most one-size-fits-all. Our last foray in the semiotics comes when Arthur undergoes his metamorphosis. He has now emerged into his final form. This scene is heavily punctuated through the use of slow-motion camera work and music. The soundtrack is a pop song played non-diegetically, Gary Glitter's Rock and Roll No. 2. To be snide for a second, Rock and Roll No. 2 is not really a song. It's pure anthem, and thus it's had a natural space in the sports arena world for decades. The troublesome aspect is that the singer, Gary Glitter, has been arrested multiple times for child pornography, which makes the song's inclusion in the film incredibly toxic. Here are some recent comments from Patrick Willems during his comprehensive look at popular music and film.
Use Rock and Roll Part 2 by Gary Glitter in a scene in Joker. I don't know, maybe he should have considered that a portion of the audience would be reminded of the fact that the singer was famously imprisoned for possession of child pornography.
But perhaps by now we've kind of gotten the point of this, as with the Joker's combination of vigilanteism and left martyrdom, which relates to punk semiotic disruptions like the swastika, and his white incel presence put forth using minority signifiers, which again relates to punk style emerging around black West Indian aesthetics. The song choice is deliberately made to provoke, at least for those who pick up on this Easter egg. We are being dared into outrage. Up to now, we have taken the character of Arthur and his material conditions, and his subsequent aesthetic transformation, as diegetic expressions of a punk ethos that confuses signs and tropes to confound the traditional ordering of society. As witnesses to his story, we either place our guard up to protect the status quo, or embrace the transgressive qualities through sympathetic identification with his struggles, or maybe a bit of each. My argument is that this is what makes the movie so fascinating to such a broad swath of people, and cuts across so many political divides, even as it was accused of so much political malpractice. But with the Gary Glitter song, we have now introduced an explicit meta element into the thesis. In other words, Arthur doesn't come down the stairs, set down a boombox, push play, and then the song starts. It happens outside his world, in ours. And that is an important clue. The significance of this hemorrhage of semiotics out of melodrama into metafiction brings us finally to here. Here's a criticism I've been anticipating. But wait, you say. Punk may be a useful analogy for showing how semiotic transgressions are utilized in a piece of art, and how that simultaneously entices and repels viewers. But I seem to be considering the movie and the punk movement as the same kinds of things, except one involved real people and the other is a fiction. I'm making a category error, a pretty big one in fact. That could be true. But if we extrapolate from Hebdage's analysis, the punk movement was kind of a fiction as well, in that it desired to negate itself by stripping context and meaning out of every rhetorical deed. Or maybe it didn't desire it, who knows, it wasn't just one thing. But when we talk about it, we aren't talking about what actually happened, but about the images. Over time, it's become all surface, and the emphasis at the time on semiotic signaling is the big reason why. And this is the point to be made with Joker. The opening title, where the word Joker fills the entire screen with Arthur writhing on the ground, is semiotic irony in all its glory. It's saying to us, whatever real emotion you may be experiencing watching this movie, it's already been made as a joke. Joker has gone one level up, in that it's not even about the movie itself, which has some complicated and interesting politics, but about the hype around it, the controversy, the clicks. And what I'm suggesting is that the movie, in a weird way, is self-aware of this, like some kind of AI that has woken up to its own futility. It's engaged in a double movement, from being red-pilled to black-pilled, to employ the pseudo-subcultural jargon, in the sense of the movie as subcultural aesthetic and the movie as commodity, intellectual property simply adapted to the moment. Dressing Joker in punk clothes is just a way to conceptualize this evolution. Where punk traded in irony, Joker in the end trades in sentimental irony, but only insofar as it serves the bottom line. And this is what makes it really hard to talk about or write about. We cannot really deal with the film's semiotics outside of the commodity form that it's packaged in. Why is that? Well, here's John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten, again, talking about what happened in the punk scene.
Outright, it became acceptable, absorbed back into the system, the shitstorm.
What Rotten gets right is that there was a moment of genuine community that was co-opted for the sake of profit. But it's more useful to understand the antagonistic style of that community's expression to the world as what made it commercially appealing. Capitalism overcoming its own contradictions by embracing that which would undermine it and figuring out a way to make a buck. The frisson, the excitement of that sense of antipathy, nihilism, misanthropy, name it what you want, created its own marketplace. In the current age, media centers have now realized the money to be had from tonguing the open wound of the online culture wars, identity politics, incels, SJWs, the whole god-awful shebang. Who needs an actual subculture anymore to bring the semiotics up to the surface? Let's move straight to exploitation. This is capitalist acceleration in the nutshell. And that's exactly what this movie, this product, pulled off. The people who made it and marketed it implied superficial elements of online pseudo-culture, incel hate speech principally, simply by pitching a comic book villain origin story told as a disaffected white male loner who goes nuts and starts shooting. It then let the media do the rest. The result was Mapplethorpe's Pornographia, Serrano's Piss Christ, Punk's Swastika, without the need for any real subcultural foundation. The two concepts, semiotics and subculture, were effectively cleaved from one another. Late-stage capitalism figured out a way to generate outrage from nothing, and in the process pulled off a real coup. It buried the politics of the movie. This essay started by showing how the movie ultimately has no faith in its own earnest melodrama, and thus is kind of punk in its negativity. But our society ultimately has been bought off from having real convictions either. So the real obscenity is that we are forced to stare at that emptiness and feign outrage. We are all punks, or we've been punked. Maybe both. The punk era is over, captured wistfully in documentaries, hopefully to be discovered by new generations of skater kids or other subcultural groups looking to offend. As for Joker, after all the controversy, the media hits and news cycles, what are we left with? Fucking memes, and a Best Actor award for Joaquin Phoenix. Punk was at least honest in its insincerity. Something crucial about it remains outside the gaping maw of capitalist realism, which is why it can be remembered at all. I doubt the same fate awaits this movie, as much as I was moved by it in the moment.
It's a joke. It's all a joke.
While watching Joker in the theater in the fall of 2019, I sat beside a middle-aged, working-class white guy. There are those semiotics again, who seemed very passionate about movies. I remember him coming up out of his seat practically cheering for the Harley Quinn movie trailer, which was clearly a kind of feminist revision of the character post-Suicide Squad. He didn't seem bothered by that at all. An hour or more later, when Arthur Fleck shoots the Wall Street guys on the subway, I heard him mutter, "They got what they deserved." Seriously, that's what he said out loud.
We spoke with your mother.
As the film went on, though, I got the vibe that his enthusiasm was waning. At the film's conclusion, with That's Life playing, I heard him say, "That movie sucked." Perhaps that guy should have been the one to write this essay. He was summing it all up. We've all been had. But by what, exactly? By the movie itself? By the cynics who made it? By the idea of the movie propagated by the media before it was even released? By the notion that culture has any real power over politics? That if only the movie actually stood for something, meant something, that things might be different? So there we are. At least we got the music, okay?
I enjoy it. I like it better than anything else.